Historical myths, the loudest, most widespread ones, the kind that make you rethink history from scratch. And what you're about to hear is one of the most thrilling trips you can take. You're watching Secret Chapters. Hit like and let's go. Our first destination is New York, or to be precise, New Amsterdam. That's what the settlement on Manhattan was originally called, founded in 1626 by Dutch merchants after a deal that became bigger than any textbook retelling. The story goes that they bought the land for a whole city with a few beads from the natives, and ever since, any suspiciously Wigadna deal, especially with a weaker side, instantly becomes a beads joke. You've heard it, but the myth here is layered. First, that famous $24 in beads and trinkets comes from exactly one document, a 1626 letter from merchant Peter Shagan, a man who never even set foot in New Amsterdam or New York, and whose context we don't know. For all we know, he was showing off, exaggerating, or spinning a story to impress someone. And this ties into another myth, the image of a merchant. When we hear the word, we imagine a rich guy in a comfortable office calmly negotiating with less powerful people. But historically, merchants lived in a totally different world. They traveled 1,000 kilometers through disease, violence, and language barriers, trying not to get killed, robbed, or simply clubbed in the head by a buyer who didn't feel like paying. And those same merchants, Columbus style, would climb onto ships and disappear for months on near-suicidal voyages to the edge of the world, often for profits that weren't even guaranteed. So a merchant back then wasn't a desk worker, he was a Swiss Army knife. Fighter, navigator, negotiator, survivor. Romantic, sure, and insanely dangerous. Sometimes being a merchant meant a more extreme life than being a pirate, which is why a merchant's letter isn't a sacred tablet truth. And second, we have a much clearer example of how the Dutch actually negotiated with the Munsee for another piece of land, Staten Island. Those talks were brutal, real bargaining wars, and the price wasn't cheap beads. They paid with 100,000 beads, clothing, tools, weapons, ammunition, and even promised yearly supplies. So with that kind of precedent, it's hard to believe Manhattan was casually handed over for 24 bucks. But even if it was, $24 in 1626 isn't pocket change in modern terms. Back then, $50 could buy a mansion. So the popular inflation conversions people throw around are shaky at best. We all know long-run inflation math is messy. Saying $24 then equals $1,500 in 2025 doesn't really capture value. In 1910 America, $2,000 could get you a massive two-story house. An official calculator might turn that into $60,000 today, but real-world prices are easily 10 times higher. So no, you shouldn't treat $24 in 1626 as a joke. And anyway, they weren't buying modern Manhattan with skyscrapers and Spider-Man. It was basically an underpopulated island on the edge of nowhere. Honestly, even today, with a few $1,000s, you could probably buy a Manhattan-sized piece of land somewhere remote in the Taiga or parts of Africa without breaking a sweat.
So yeah, the Manhattan for beads story collapses on multiple historical levels, and that's before we even say out loud the awkward part. The Dutch, and later the English, didn't really care about treaties in the first place, and eventually a lot of land was simply taken by force, which leads us straight into the next myth. You've seen the pattern, even if you never stopped to unpack it, at least once you've noticed it. Argentina has very little black population, while Brazil, right next door, has a lot. And you've definitely heard the classic Civil War contrast. The American South had tons of enslaved people. The North had far fewer. People explain that with everything under the sun. The North was magically more humane. Argentina's elites were different, ocean currents, or even what certain ancestors were doing in 1945. But the boring, brutal driver is malaria. Before antibiotics and modern medicine, life wasn't guided by moral debates. It was guided by survival. Nature set the rules. And since we brought up 1945, look at the World War II era malaria map. The overlap is almost comical. Malaria in the Americas lines up through Brazil and reaches up to the Mason-Dixon line in the US. And the Mason-Dixon line isn't just geography. It's the unofficial North-South divide with slavery, Civil War politics, and everything attached. Malaria, by the way, was also carried into the New World by colonists, and people from many African regions, especially closer to sub-Saharan areas, had significantly better genetic protection against malaria. That's why demand for enslaved Africans was so intense in places like Brazil and the southern US. Meanwhile, farther north and farther south, Europeans didn't get hit as hard, and importing enslaved labor often wasn't even the best economic move. It wasn't nobility. It was biology and profit. If malaria had been widespread in the northern US, the slave trade would have pushed hard there too. And then who knows what the map of history would look like. In theory, slavery in the US might have lasted longer if nature hadn't tilted the playing field. First, it punished Africans with suffering and pushed them into regions where Europeans were weakened by malaria. And later, it indirectly helped as industrial centers grew and conflicts played out differently. And the more you think about how one natural factor can reshape entire civilizations, the more unsettling it gets. I'll leave that thought for your comments. Let's move on and talk about katanas. The image is automatic. Japanese masters, blades slicing concrete, the final form of melee weapons. Katanas show up in the 15th century when firearms like arquebuses are already in play in Europe and cold steel is starting to lose its dominance. So it's easy to assume the katana must be the ultimate refined sword. Add anime romance and cultural myth and it becomes legendary. But the reality is way less poetic. A real 15th century katana, shown to even the most mediocre Viking smith from 500 years earlier, would probably get laughed at. Almost everything people believe about katanas is myth. First, the unique repeated folding technique. It wasn't unique at all. The Celts were doing that 2,000 years before katanas existed. It's ancient technology. Second, katanas weren't dramatically harder than other swords, and they didn't magically hold an edge longer. Tatara furnaces have been studied in detail, and they generally produced steel with less carbon than what Vikings were working with. And if you look at places like Persia, by the 10th century they were producing sword steel using crucible methods that look surprisingly modern. And when people brag about katana hardness, that's actually a problem, not a flex. A good sword needs elasticity. In feudal Japan, the police literally carried jute batons designed for one job, snapping katanas. Try that on a Viking sword? You won't, even if you're desperate. Third point, in the 15th century, Shogun Tokugawa himself reportedly said that the older Kodo-era swords from the 10th century were built better than the katanas being made in Japan at the time, and he ordered smiths to return to the old construction. And the timing is brutal because the 15th century is exactly when metallurgy is accelerating worldwide. Japan, drifting backward and isolating itself, basically missed the train. So the katana ends up being the best sword for Japan specifically within Japan's resources and constraints. The steel was decent but not elite, and isolation slowed down the exchange of techniques with the rest of the world. Result, a blade that's impressive inside the country but doesn't make engineers worldwide gasp. Meanwhile, Viking swords, despite the dirty barbarian stereotype, were often stronger from a pure engineering perspective. Part of that comes down to the way Vikings carbon-enriched steel, even using animal bone in their processes to increase toughness. So the katana myth isn't just a little exaggerated. It's a full mythology layered on top of a blade that made sense in its context, but wasn't some global superweapon. And to close in classic channel style, let's jump to ancient Rome. Let's remember this once and for all. Caligula wasn't so insane that he literally appointed his horse as a senator or even a consul. Sources like Suetonius and Cassius note that he adored Incitatus, spoiled it with gifts, and joked that the horse deserved to be consul. That's the factual core, and beyond it, we're mostly in interpretation. The more believable reading is that Caligula talked up the horse out of contempt for the human consuls, basically saying, even a horse could do your job. Or he was making a point about absolute power, which Roman emperors loved to perform. Nero is similar, except the "he watched Rome burn and sang" story collapses even faster. We have a strong source, Tacitus, who lived through the fire. He writes that Nero sheltered displaced civilians in his properties, funded firefighting efforts, and looked genuinely shaken for the 6 days the fire lasted. Then, Nero pushed through regulations that echo to this day. Ever noticed how main building exits are required to face streets rather than inner courtyards, even though courtyards feel safer and cozier? That's tied to Nero's post-fire measures. He also mandated minimum spacing between buildings and tougher standards for construction materials.
In many ways, he helped shape the backbone of modern fire safety rules. And yes, Nero and Caligula had plenty of ugly behavior in other areas, but they're historical figures, and slapping good or bad labels on them is a shallow way to read people from entirely different moral worlds. Should we keep going with this myth-busting format? Drop your take in the comments. And if you enjoyed the episode, hit like and subscribe. New videos soon. See ya!